Hi everyone, I'm Habiba Islam. I'm an advisor at 80,000 Hours and I'll be your MC for this Q&A session with Toby Ord. Toby is a moral philosopher at Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute, and he's the author of The Precipice. His work focuses on the big picture questions facing humanity. His current research is on avoiding the threat of existential risk, which he considers to be among the most pressing and neglected issues we face. His earlier work explored the ethics of global health and global poverty, which led him to create Giving What We Can, whose members have pledged hundreds of millions of pounds to the most effective charities helping to improve the world. He also co-founded the wider effective altruism movement. Welcome to EA Global, Toby.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
So we'll dive straight into our first question from Brian Tan. So it's been almost a year since the release of The Precipice. How do you feel about how people have been receiving it?
Oh, it's been going very well. Despite bookstores being closed when it came out in most places, it's sold very well, which is good, and also got lots of reviews on like the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker and some non-New York related places, and so yeah, that's been really nice to see people actually engaging with it. But it's still very difficult when I see so few people face to face.
Yeah, I imagine your sort of plans for the rollout and book tour type things didn't go quite as you planned.
Exactly. I expected to get some kind of feeling of there is actually a book out there. I'm not just reading numbers off a spreadsheet, but alas.
And have you seen the book having an impact already?
I think so, at least in terms of engagement with the government in the UK, and have been able to work quite a lot with government and Parliament on various questions related to risk. So, and hopefully they'll be improving their processes to be better able to see catastrophic risks coming than they were recently.
So we'll have some questions about COVID later on as well. But I'd like to start by talking about the case that you make in The Precipice for why working on reducing existential risk is an important moral priority. So in The Precipice, you make a number of different arguments, looking to the past, the present, the future, thinking about civilizational virtues and our cosmic significance. Just to start off, I wanted to ask, what do you think about the strength of these various different arguments? And for example, would you like to see more discussion of in the EA community that appeal to sort of these different moral priorities?
Yeah, good question. I do think that that previously a lot of our focus really has been on the future style argument, which I think is ultimately the best. But I think that there are a wide range of different moral viewpoints or different moral foundations that can all lead you to the same place. And so we can take more people along for that journey if we kind of notice that it's not just like one set of views that leads you here. I think that the case based on the present, so for example, the people who would die if we went extinct, is the most robust case. It's kind of hard to argue that is an absolute tragedy. But then other cases like the future give you, if you accept it, gives you a stronger reason. You might think you don't need a stronger reason than everyone dying. But if we're talking about a chance of it happening, say a 1 in 100 chance of it happening, then maybe there being more than 10 future generations could be an important aspect for changing that effect. I think that one of the things that I'm proudest about with the book is making this case based on the past and appealing to a lot of deontological views and positions and linking in with some conservative thought. And I found that all of these arguments, I think, were strong enough that I felt good about putting them in the book. There were some arguments that have been suggested. I didn't just include everything. And so only ones that I felt, really kind of moved me. And then when it comes to civilizational virtue, I think probably the way I mainly see that one is that it's a useful way to diagnose what's going wrong and how to fix it, to notice that humanity is impatient, and so forth, seems to resonate and to be helpful to kind of explain we need more patience, and these different virtues, I think, are useful for that. And then the cosmic significance is a very common one, actually, that in the literature, particularly from cosmologists and people like Martin Rees or Max Tegmark. And I think that there's something to it, but I'm not sure it's as strong as just the sheer amount of the future that we'd be losing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is something reassuring that there are many different roads or many different groundings for sort of coming to this similar conclusion. It's not as outlandish conclusions as one might think. And then I guess I wanted to dive into specifically, we had some questions around the case looking to the present. So you mentioned that you think this is a very robust argument for sort of why we might want to focus on existential risks, or specifically extinction risks. Could you give some like central examples of like practical overlap between the goals of reducing existential risk and reducing catastrophic risk this century?
Yeah, I think that for most existential risks, actually either lens identifies very similar things. In some sense, perhaps the one that's the most different actually is climate change, where a lot of the warming that we're going to experience over the next few decades is baked in based on actions to do with emissions that were happening a few decades back. So that's one of the very big lag. Whereas I think most of the other things, it does actually come out pretty similarly. It does diagnose the same kinds of risks.
Mm-hmm. And are there any kind of practical divergence points beyond that?
Not that come to mind. I mean, I think that it's just more to do with the strength of the argument.
Okay, well, that's reassuring for if you want to try and make the case for based on purely on the case of the present. But switching to the case looking to the future then, a top-rated question on the forum from Ben Millward. You've previously spoken about the need to reach existential security, i.e. in order to believe that the future is long and large, we have to believe that existential risk per year will eventually drop close to zero. That makes it worthwhile, us working on existential risks. Just to finish that question, we talked a bit, I was just describing the need to reach existential security, i.e. get existential risk per year down to a manageable level. Do you have a sense of what the best reasons for believing that this can happen, and how convincing do those reasons seem to you?
Yeah, the argument's right that that we would need to be able to reach existential security in order to have a very long future. I think that one of the main reasons is just that imagine that you were controlling human civilization, that it's fairly obvious that in order to have a long future, that you need to be able to get these risks low. And then in the case of a lot of these risks, we can get them low. So for example, things like nuclear war, you could just not have nuclear wars if it was with a single point of control. So it's kind of trying to imagine how hard it is. What I'm trying to suggest is that most of the problems come from failure of coordination between different groups, rather than inherent difficulties in understanding how we could actually have a safe future. And so it comes down to kind of other weighting so that we can produce worlds where, that are win-win situations. But ultimately, I think that the type of future that we need with existential security is just a pretty conservative win-win future. And I'm optimistic that we can actually get to those kinds of places.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like you think that if one did have a view that reaching existential security was very unlikely, it actually wouldn't be a worthwhile to work on existential risk reduction.
Not that it wouldn't be worthwhile, but that we wouldn't have a very long future. Maybe we would just have, another, 20 generations or something like that. So it's it could still, and since I suggested that it could be worthwhile just based on the present, the people who would be lost in the initial catastrophe, they could still be very much worthwhile working on existential risk in those cases. But it's as to the question about, is a very long future relevant to the understanding, I think it would require reaching existential security.
Okay, and then just to recap your points on the original part of the question. So it seems like to you that it's both theoretically and it seems like it would be practically possible to get to this low level of existential risk, and the kinds of barriers that you see in the way seem to be like global coordination problems, which seem to you're optimistic that those are solvable. And I'm wondering, just to dig a bit further, what gives you that optimism that those kind of coordination problems are solvable?
Yeah, that's right. But it doesn't have to be soon, I should say. we're talking sometime in the next few centuries or something, we get to a point of international coordination where we can solve those problems.
Okay. And then one of the other pieces of the sort of case for the future is around the sort of views on population ethics or population axiologies, roughly how to compare outcomes with different people or different numbers of people. And you talk in the book, in the appendix, about some different theories here. And it seems like sort of taking a total view is one of the least bad theories that there are, but it's possibly not the only plausible theory or that there is out there. I'm curious, do you have a sense of what credence you have in different views?
That's right. So I'm not sure how much you heard, but I do find that the total view, I think, is the most plausible, where everyone counts across the whole future and the past. Everyone counts for one. And we don't discount people based on the fact that they don't yet exist or something like that. But I think that some people talk about the average view, where there's some kind of average well-being over time is what you're trying to maximize. I have very low credence in that. I think that there are very strong arguments against it. It's basically been entirely rejected by the philosophical community. I think that person-affecting views, there are some intuitions behind them that I think are plausible and worth exploring. But when you try to put it together to have a precise, coherent view, they tend to run into a lot of trouble, and they tend not to say what you think that they would, and lead to kind of various kind of strange conclusions, and also kind of cycles of preferences and things like this. So,
and some abhorrent conclusions as well.
Yeah, exactly. So population ethics is very difficult, and I don't think that the case for existential risk relies upon something like the total view. It makes it simpler and stronger, but I think that one thing to notice is that most people, for most different plausible population ethics views, we think that things that would hurt people across all time in future generations, even if it perhaps changes the identities of those people as well, is extremely bad. And so things like a total collapse of civilization would still be extremely bad, as would some kind of permanent dystopia. So it may be that people who have different views on population ethics would find those cases additionally important, even if they thought they were less probable. So there could be some effects like that. But ultimately, I think that it really doesn't depend upon your view on population ethics.
You do mention that there are some theories that might say that we have some reason to create lives with high well-being, but have a stronger reason to help existing people or avoid lives of negative well-being. Do you think that those kind of theories are like particularly plausible?
Yeah, I think that's the best kind of person-affecting views. But I still think that the total view is just the most plausible. But I do share some of this intuition, like that particularly when you put it the way you just did, that it's even more important to help people than to create people, where the amount of happiness in the created people's lives is only similar to the amount you're helping the other people by. It seems to certainly kind of weird and off topic to say, instead of helping these people, let's create these other people. There seems something kind of problematic about that response, although it rarely comes up as a response like that. For example, in this case, the idea that instead of trying to help current people, we need to save the future of humanity doesn't sound like that much. It doesn't sound like that same kind of problematic kind of statement. I mean, the idea, for example, well, hang the future of humanity, we need to help people now, but then we'll lose our future, sounds kind of bad as well. So, so I think this is one of these cases where it's actually the existential risk concern is just based on the pretty intuitive parts of population ethics, rather than the kind of strange conclusions that it can sometimes lead to.
Okay. And much of the case for then practically trying to work to reduce some of these existential risks relies on the practical estimates that you give for the sort of the likelihood of these happening in the sort of nearish future. By nearish future, I mean the next century or two. So you give some estimates for this in the Precipice, putting the chance overall in the next century of an existential catastrophe at 1 in 6, which seems alarmingly high. But Brian Tan has asked, do you think the emergence of COVID-19 has increased or decreased our level of existential risk this century, and why?
Yeah, I think actually it's probably decreased the risk. That is provided something of a warning shot, reminding people that humanity is still vulnerable to catastrophe. It's not the case that just because it's been 100 years since a pandemic as bad as this, that we've solved pandemics. You might think that, but this is a reminder that we haven't. So I think that that's been helpful. But on the other hand, as to my actual probability of risk may have gone up, because as well as the pandemic perhaps causing things to get a bit better, it also let us gain information that governments of developed countries seem to be like worse at handling this than we might have expected. And that the international coordination was pretty terrible as well. So overall, there's some kind of depressing news plus a silver lining that maybe it's warned us a bit. And overall, I don't really know what to say.
Although you gave us those the other way around, you gave us a silver lining first, and then
yeah, that's right. It was yeah.
I was wondering. People talk about COVID being a sort of once in a generation type event, and I'm wondering what you think about that kind of language, whether that's actually maybe quite unhelpful for the discussions around existential risk.
Yeah, it's a good question. I find thinking in terms of probabilities as also recurrence times. So, for example, a 1 in 100 per year being a recurrence time of once a century. I find that to be helpful. It gives you a kind of idea about the kind of scale. Some people seem to think that it's then periodic and it happens kind of like clockwork every 100 years. And that's obviously a mistaken understanding of what these recurrence times are meant to be, but it's a fairly common mistake. And so maybe it is something to avoid. I'm not sure how that shakes out.
And also whether presumably COVID-19 this current pandemic doesn't quite hit the levels of an existential risk. And if people think that this is the worst that we're going to get in the next generation, then maybe that makes people more complacent.
Yeah, we certainly don't want people to think that. I'm not sure. I mean, actually, it'd be a good thing for someone to run some surveys on as to whether using this language really does prompt them to think that we're safe now. Yeah.
Okay, well, for anyone who's listening who's interested in that kind of thing, there's an interesting project for you. Another question from Sabrina. When thinking about the likelihood of different existential risks, how does your thinking process differ for assigning subjective versus objective probabilities? And they give the example, how do you think about asteroid impacts versus AI safety?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. We tend to think of asteroid impacts as an objective probability. And at least the way I think about objective probabilities in this context is that it's something where if you got a whole lot of different scientists, the same kind of evidence base, that they would come to very similar numbers. Another way to put that is your prior washes out based on the evidence. And even when it comes to something like an asteroid risk, there is an objective component of that, which is something like the chance in a typical century that the Earth gets hit by an asteroid of a certain size. And scientists would tend to have pretty similar views on that. But then there's actually that's not the whole question. We also need to know what's the chance if you get hit by a 3-kilometer asteroid that humanity survives that. And we actually have very little idea about that. And so it's kind of multiplied by one of these subjective probabilities based on an event that's never happened before. That is, humanity going extinct, or not in the grounds of being hit by an asteroid. So I think that it's less of a difference in kind, and that all of these types of estimates have a subjective component. And so, one does what one can on these things, but unfortunately, one has to face the subjective thing in all of the cases, and it definitely makes the error bars wider on what's the right thing. All the numbers I try to give in the Precipice for risks are thought of as something like an order of magnitude estimate. So if I say, 1 in 10, that means somewhere between 1 in 30 and 1 in 3.
And Sabrina also points out that one thing that might make assigning probabilities hard is low probability events don't have clear feedback loops to be able to sort of assign accurate probabilities. How did you deal with that, or how do you deal with that when you're trying to ascertain probabilities?
Well, yeah, you're right. There's generally lack of feedback in a lot of these predictions, makes them extremely difficult. But sometimes one can get feedback for similar parts of events. So if you can decompose something into a couple of different types of events, some of which have occurred before, then you can try to get feedback on those. But ultimately, I would just say overall, there's not much of an answer, but it is a real challenge, and it definitely means that one should be more skeptical of these types of estimates. Ultimately, the estimates in the book are not in any way meant to say, if you're a kind of good EA, then you should agree with these estimates on reading the book. And they're also not supposed to say that that the arguments just on the pages of the book are supposed to compel you to those numbers. Rather, I thought that I have a mental state about how high these different risks are in comparison to each other, and it's useful to communicate that to the reader, because that's the kind of thing that they might want to know. If someone's written this book, could they please at least tell me what they think about the size of these risks? And that's what I was trying to do.
And that leads on very nicely to the next question about someone who does disagree with you about some of these probabilities, Will McCaskill. So Jack Mald asks, my understanding is that there remain a few important points of friendly disagreement between you and Will McCaskill on the influentialness of the present and the probability of existential risk this century. So Jack's interested to know, are you going to be discussing those topics with Will further to potentially reach agreement? Or are you at a stage where you're happy to disagree?
Oh, I mean, we're somewhat happy to disagree. As we certainly, respect each other's opinion on this a lot. And to some extent, if I know that Will continues to disagree after thinking more and reading more on it, then I, will adjust my probabilities somewhat in accordance with that, even if I don't fully understand where he's coming from. But ultimately, on that discussion, we have talked about it a little bit more, and I think we have come somewhat closer together. In particular, I think that the bit where we disagreed the most was on this question of how extreme should one's prior be, that this century is the most important, or one of the most important centuries in the whole of human history and the future. And Will thought that, if you think that there could be many millions of centuries, then the prior probability is something like, 1 in a million. And I think that he's changed his mind of this conversation. And that was the bit where we disagreed the most. He thinks there must be some other way of getting to that. And if you try to run the style of argument he did, you run very close to something called the doomsday argument, and various kinds of, which is a very controversial argument. So I think there's something to it, but I just think that we're in dangerous territory where you could shoot your foot off with these styles of argument. But also Will's been thinking a lot about the actual existential risks. He's been looking into questions about biosecurity and AI, and trying to rethink them from the ground up. And that's also an interesting source of evidence. And I'm really interested to see what he comes up with. I think he's going to put his views on that in his new book.
Great. So just moving on to some specific careers advice that you might have for people wanting to work on this area. Do you have any particular advice, and perhaps do you have any advice that might be different from 80,000 hours? Perhaps if you could offer generic advice in a paragraph or 3, what might you say?
I mean, I would pretty much defer to 80,000 hours on this. I think they do great work on it. I'm unfortunately at a part of my career, and I started in this stuff before EA was a thing. And the opportunities and so forth are very different. So my own career is not actually that helpful for trying to work out what to do. So actually, no, I would just say, see what 80K has to say about it, or listen to the final bits of some of the podcast episodes and see what some of their people are interviewing have to say. But I'm not sure I have anything particularly valuable to add on top of it.
But thank you for the plug nonetheless. Moving on to some sort of questions a bit more about things in your sort of personal questions. You recently shared a sweet anecdote on Twitter about your daughter volunteering to be the youngest person in the world to take part in a specific COVID vaccine trial for children, I understand. I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about that before we sort of move on to the question that Tessa asked about this.
Oh, yeah, she my wife heard about this trial and asked my daughter if she was interested, and she said, her eyes lit up and she was like, "Oh, that's amazing." And we said, "Well, why?" And she said, "Because I'd get to help all of these children find out whether it's whether the vaccine works for children." And we explained that there are some children who could be particularly vulnerable to COVID and would be in kind of good reason to take the vaccine if it was available. And she was really eager to be able to help a lot of people and to be part of doing something to prevent this pandemic, or to end it. So she's just really excited to be able to do her part.
It's really lovely. And Tessa asks that this got her wondering What do you think about parenting in relation to your career and commitments as an effective altruist? What crucial considerations, if any, do you think effective altruists should take into account when thinking about whether or not to become parents?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, it's a very big, irreversible decision. And it is just a huge amount of time. And you're not really going to, one kind of useful thing to know is that if you want to create more effective altruists or, more people generally who'll make the world a better place, it is substantially easier to do that by convincing other adults to take on board these ideas than it is to raise an entire new person. But once you notice that, it's kind of liberating because you don't have to, fret or spend your time worrying about whether you're indoctrinating your kid or something. And you can instead just kind of take time and enjoy being with them and, try to inspire them with your values as any parent would. So that's kind of helpful. But it is a very large time commitment. It's the kind of thing that then thinking, is this a good kind of thing to replace all my other hobbies or most of my other hobbies or something like that, in terms of all these kind of non-work ways that I spend my time. And if it is,
thanks
or,
for that.
yeah.
No, Karen. And if it is,
yeah, I mean, then do it. I mean, it's but have kids if you or your partner both feel that this is a really important part of your lives, and something that's that's really central to it.
Yes, I think Alex Gordon Brown said something similar in the section with Julia Wise yesterday. I actually just want to circle back to some questions about specific existential risks that we had from people. So in the Precipice, you talk about existential risk factors as these sort of like almost a step before the existential risks. Are those what you might see as the current frontier in long-termist intervention research?
I guess that they are a frontier. So yeah, this is an idea that I try to make cleanly in the book. It's also been talked about before by people under kind of, there's a related kind of concepts like a risk multiplier or something, although it needn't actually mathematically multiply a risk. But things like war between great powers, the way I think about it is you think, what would be the existential risk in the world that going forward as we expect it to be? And then what would the risk be if there was definitely no war between great powers? And then you look at the difference between the two, and that's how many percentage points of existential risk factor war between great powers makes up. And I think that if you do something like that, you'll see that it's probably more than a percentage point, in which case it's probably bigger than almost all actual existential risks. And so we should be thinking seriously about some of these risk factors. That said, this is something that is less neglected. Questions about avoiding this. A lot of people want world peace, and this is kind of what they're talking about. So in some sense, it's less of a frontier because there's more people who've researched it. But there's relatively little incorporating of that research into effective altruism, or thinking about, trying to think seriously about what are all the kinds of risk factors, and then how could we rate and compare them.
Yeah, I wonder more generally about how when one starts to think about these risk factors and what sort of human society should do to try and bring these risks down in general, we start to sort of converge on some of the same areas that I guess human civilization has like already started to seems to do like reasonably well, or sort of attention already goes to some of those kinds of things. I don't know whether what you think about that kind of convergence. Does it actually seem like some of the most promising things for reducing existential risks actually end up lining up with sort of some sort of commonsensical policy ideas? Yeah,
I think it's good in terms of increases the chance that we're on the right track. That we might have thought that these ideas were a bit outlandish, but then you realize that things like avoiding war between great powers is could be a really good way to achieve it. You think, oh, okay, it's actually less outlandish than you would think. So that's good. It makes it more likely to be true. Although there's also an aspect where maybe there's less value add from thinking about these things in our community, because we end up in a more similar place. So I think, those things trade off against each other.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I do warn in the book that there's a danger of a certain kind of complacency where you note that a whole lot of common sense important activities would, as some kind of effect, reduce existential risk, and then just replace the key insights and key ideas with just this everyday stuff that everyone already believes and is already trying to do. So I think that could be a real downfall and kind of watering down of the strength of these ideas. So I think there's a real challenge there as to how to kind of square that circle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess another thing I was thinking in terms of thinking about these existential risk factors, a lot of the discussion around AI as an existential risk seems to have moved at least somewhat in the direction of thinking about it as a risk factor, and perhaps in the way that interacts with things like great power relations and the global economic system and things like that. Do you have a view about how you think about AI risks now, whether it's sort of primarily more of this kind of existential risk directly or functions as a risk factor?
Yeah, definitely some of both. I probably, compared to some people, my view on it is actually not that different to Nick Bostrom in Superintelligence. Some people think, oh, we've gone so much, beyond that, and things have shaped and changed. Although Stuart Russell's book was also pretty similar, in terms of what he thought was the threat to Nick. I think Nick was pretty much right. If I found out that, if someone told me that actually the real risks are in fact, from say permanently entrenched inequality, or some of these things that Paul Christiano has kind of suggested could be one of the big risks, and are not from something where we really just lose almost all the value of the future, I would be deeply relieved. It's these other things that really keep me awake at night. That said, it's also, if you want to get all technical about it, maybe AI just overall should count as a risk factor, because AI itself is not a catastrophe. Whereas the asteroid hitting you, asteroid impact, is kind of easy to see how that's the catastrophe that kills everyone. Whereas AI itself doesn't kill everyone. Maybe if everyone dies, they die through deployment of chemical or biological weapons that were designed by the AI or something like that. There's some kind of question as to what's going on. There's a bit of an aspect of one of these risks is not like the others, because there's this extra ... before you kind of connect as to why it's an existential catastrophe. And that, people have also wondered, would this AI catastrophe be extinction, or would it be something else? I think that that it probably actually wouldn't involve extinction would be my best guess, because but it would involve taking control of the future from us, and probably that humanity achieves very little of its potential in one of these catastrophe scenarios. But it's not much of a silver lining if there's a few people left around for the AI to study.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it is actually a bit unclear, and a lot of the public don't really know how it's supposed to fit into this kind of questions about, is it an extinction risk or is it not, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. We also had a couple of questions around mechanisms for actually managing to mitigate some of these existential risks, and to what extent they need strong governmental policies, perhaps to what extent they may actually need global surveillance and policing capabilities to sort of to achieve stability in the face of this continued technological development. Do you have any thoughts on those as potential avenues for, or like how necessary those things might be for working on existential risk reduction?
And what were those things? Was surveillance, global surveillance, and
policing capabilities?
Policing. Yeah. I mean, I know Nick's kind of worried about this. And it partly depends upon how easy it ends up being technologically in order to lead to some existential catastrophe. And the shorter the amount of time needed by a concerted effort to do it, the harder it is to police and the more invasive it would need to be in order to stop it. With that in mind, that's all the more reason to try to cut things off before they get that close. Don't develop the technologies that would be needed to get to a situation where person with undergraduate level experience in the relevant science within a year could cause this catastrophe. Try to leave a larger gap, between where we are and where the catastrophe is to avoid that. That'd be my advice. It may be that ultimately we do need some kind of additional surveillance, but I guess I would say let's try to avoid that. treat that concern as something to do something about, avoiding getting into that situation, rather than to just accept that now.
Mm-hmm. And now I'd like to ask a couple more philosophy kinds of questions again. So you also recently published a book on moral uncertainty with Will MacAskill and another.
Krista Bickfist.
Yes, thank you. What practical ramifications do you think taking moral uncertainty seriously has for how we should think about what's most important, specifically the case for working on existential risks?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One natural thing is that if you're not sure, how important existential risk is, then one could apply these ideas of moral uncertainty, take seriously other cases that say it's more important. I think that would particularly apply if you had some view that says it's just not important at all for some reason. For example, there's not going to be anyone around, so there's no morality after we all die, and therefore after we die it wasn't bad, or something like that. Suppose you have a view like that. I think that's a very bad argument. But if someone had that view, then they should note that they're not completely certain of that, or at least I hope that they're not, and that other possibilities could be true as well, and that people whose moral views they respect and whose reasoning they respect have very different conclusions, and that should lead them to be uncertain. And then once you factor in some reasonable chance of this, then it ends up quite bad in expectation. So that's one approach. But I would say more broadly, taking moral uncertainty seriously over the last 10 or so years, it leads one to think a bit differently about ethical questions. If it's not the case that there's a kind of winner-take-all, where there's kind of which ethical theory do I believe, and then there's everything else. If instead you care about whether you think something is 1% credence in it or 10% credence in it, then you're interested to find out what's the best version of it. What's the best version of that argument? Maybe actually that's better than another one that I also don't believe, but I thought I had some kind of credence in. What's the best version of like political ideologies that I don't support? And what's the best version of these types of moral theories that I don't support? And then you can it actually affects you and changes kind of your overall view about these things. And so it makes you more interested in hearing what other people have to say about, coming from their different perspectives. So I think that's valuable. In some ways, it gives you some of the advantages that moral pluralism has, but without some of the theoretical disadvantages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you're saying that it has sort of practical benefits just in the way that you engage with politics and sort of, and maybe just like people around you in general as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's nice. I also wanted to ask you some questions about meta-ethics, which is roughly the question of sort of where does the force of these moral arguments even come from? Are there actually sort of morally true facts out there about the world? And I wonder if this perhaps affects some of these questions. It sort of seems like maybe a driver for some of the moral uncertainty, perhaps. It sort of seems like maybe if you take a certain view on meta-ethics where you think that there are some morally true facts about the world, it might lead you in the direction of simpler, more universal, more parsimonious accounts of what is actually good, like, for example, total utilitarianism. I'm interested to know what your personal views are on meta-ethical questions.
Okay, so firstly, I think you're right that sometimes in philosophy we say that there's no connection between what you think moral terms mean. When we have discussions about what's right and wrong, what we actually mean by that. Mm-hmm. That some people say there's no connection between that and the kinds of moral claims that we think are true. I think you're right that there is a connection, and if it's a fundamental kind of concept about, say, a universe that has minds that experience things or that have desires, then you might expect it to be a very simple type thing. Where if instead it's just some very complex thing to do with what actual humans want, and humans happen to have very complex bodies and brains, and so it could be that they want very complex things, and then you'd have much less of a kind of bias in favor of simplicity. So I think that's all true. And I think that I'm not sure what to think about meta-ethics, but I have general sympathy for realist accounts of it, where moral claims are indeed true or false, and also a kind of strong bias towards simplicity. So I guess if I change my mind, I would then have less of that that kind of effect.
Yeah. Great. They're going to move on to some sort of slightly quicker questions for the last few minutes. So from Brian Tan, are you interested in starting to write another book in the next 5 years? And if so, what might you write about?
Probably not in the next 5 years. It's a lot of work. But
how long did the Precipice take to write? Sorry, in total.
I think it was 4 years. But yeah, there was. I think I went to EA Global 2016, I think, and then I looked through my old email, and then almost immediately afterwards decided to write this book, and I think it was 4 years before publication. So.
Okay, so not a new book immediately next, then.
No. Although I guess if it was, then maybe some aspect of long-termism was quite plausible.
What was the most unexpected thing that you learned in researching and writing The Precipice?
I would say actually quite a big thing was understanding the past of humanity. I think that there's a temptation to think, well, the past is kind of irrelevant. Is we're just, going forward, what's done is done, now let's think about the future, and the effects of our actions on the future are all that matters, and we could ignore the past. But the past is a very good guide to a lot of things. But it also really coming to terms with the fact that there have been 100 billion humans before us. And that, lasting over 2,000 centuries or 10,000 generations. Really helped me realize just how hard a lot of things are, and how it kind of required like a whole lot of insights, spread over many, many lifetimes to get to where we are. And it gave me this kind of additional gratitude and appreciation of the past, and also made me think it just much more normal and natural that there could be 10,000 generations ahead of us as well.
Yeah, the first chapter, I think, in The Precipice has this lovely sort of big history take on sort of how we've got to where we are today, which I think leads very nicely into this gratitude, this sort of looking to the past kind of argument for why we might want to work on existential risks. In what ways was writing a book like The Precipice different from how you'd expected?
I guess it was substantially less lonely. I had some excellent help through the writing process. I think Andrew Snyder-Beatty was there right at the start, and he was the one who suggested that someone at FHI should write a book, and then we quickly realized existential risk, and I think I tried for quite a while to say it shouldn't be me. Maybe there should be someone else who should write it, but eventually I stepped up to it. But then Joe Carlsmith came on, helping me with it, and then he got a lot of other people involved as well, got quite a big team ultimately, and then Matthew van der Merwe kind of took it home for the last year, and so it's just really great to work with these people, and this kind of camaraderie was really unexpected.
This is maybe unfair for a short question, but what's the most valid criticism of The Precipice, either as a whole or specific points that you've read since the book was published?
It's a good question. One thing that I guess one of these. I think that I don't say quite enough about how risks could combine. I think that's something that the researchers at CSER think about a lot. The reason I didn't talk about it that much is I don't have that much to say about it. I did say a bit about a kind of technical aspect about how they combine, but I think that people are most interested in this non-technical aspect. What I talked about, was how if something's a 50% risk of extinction and something else is a 50% risk of extinction, how do you combine those numbers together? Is that 100% risk, or is it a 75% risk? Is it a 50% risk? And how does that work? And what are the consequences of that? And I say some interesting things about that. But because I didn't have that much interesting to say about what does a non-lethal kind of set of climate change combined with kind of, say, bad choices at the governance level, how do these things combine? I had a lot less to say about it, and so I didn't talk much about it. And I think that there is a gap there.
Well, so certainly maybe an opportunity for some additional work by other people to fill in. What's something that you're reading or listening to at the moment that you'd recommend to other people?
What I'm reading, when I fall asleep every night at the moment is a book called X Risk by Thomas Moynihan.
Does that sound like relaxing bedtime reading?
it's not that relaxing, but it's extremely good, and I've really enjoyed it, and has actually then inspired me to think about a lot of additional things that I would be putting in the book if I was still writing the Precipice, and so hopefully we'll do some work together. But I think it's a fantastic book. It's about the intellectual history behind existential risk, where all the ideas came from.
Nice, good one to check out. What, if anything, have you changed your mind about over the last year?
I guess a lot of COVID-related things. It's been the main thing on a lot of people's minds. One of them, for example, was that with all of the debates in the UK about whether to lock down or not to lock down at the start, it was only months later that when the mobility data came out about what people are actually doing, you could see that people had actually 90% of the drop in mobility happened before the government announced a lockdown. And so it's this realization, oh, there was all this debate about whether locking down would be good or bad, but everyone had just assumed that the government decides whether we lock down or not. But actually, it's more to do with the government's messaging and how seriously they appear to be taking it. And once they started to be taking it extremely gravely, people got the message. I thought that's just one example, but I think anyone who's been following COVID closely has hopefully changed their mind on quite a few things.
It's been an astonishing year in many ways. But one thing that happened over the last year, given what we can celebrated reaching 5,000 members towards the end of last year. How do you feel about the organization and how it's progressed over the last decade?
Yeah, that was a fantastic milestone. We'd been having fantastic exponential growth for quite a while. And then for various reasons, I think the main one being that CEA wanted to focus on effective altruism itself and to say, this is a really, a concept that's really going places. We could try to nurture it, but also to try to kind of take it to the world stage. There'd been less emphasis on giving what we can. And so we kind of fallen off this exponential growth in our members and our impact in the world. And I think that was a shame. And so it's been fantastic to revitalize it and to say to all the members, don't worry, we're here, we're back. There's a lot of stuff happening, and we've not forgotten people. And in fact, we've got a whole lot more people who are joining us. And so, I think that it's going very well under Luke's new directorship.
That's great. We do have time for some of the live audience questions from Slido. So I'm just going to jump into a couple of these. Do you believe an artistic and cultural movement around long-termism is necessary to ensure its spread, and how can we help create one?
Maybe. I'm quite open to this. I think a good example actually would be to think about the Long Now Foundation. That is an example. If you say, what would a non-EA long-termist thing look like that's kind of in the art direction? And I think the Long Now Foundation is a good example. I think there's great people there. I think that it would be interesting to see an EA version of a kind of art and cultural long-termist thing as well. And EA doesn't often get into this kind of cultural space. But I think that there's also some projects in the UK on this that I've been involved with a little bit. The Serpentine Galleries kind of got involved with some of this. And so I'm not really sure as to what it would look like, but I'm actually quite optimistic about it. I think there's a lot of very inspiring ideas surrounding the long-termism, particularly including the long-term past as well as long-term future.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of scope for sort of science fiction and fantasy to sort of help with people like being able to think about utopian futures and things like that. And is it the Long Now Foundation? Were they involved in the sort of the piece of music that's being played over an extremely long period of time? Is that them?
I'm not sure. They could well be. Their clock is like their kind of like signature thing. But they've got lots of good things. Stuart Brand is just generally fantastic, kind of long-term thinker, and they've got a lot of good people.
A question about this sort of history that we were talking about as well. How can long-termists draw inspiration from past reforms, for example, women's suffrage and US civil rights movements, to increase consideration for future generations?
I guess I don't know, but I agree. The question suggests that we should, and I agree with them. I would need to know more about the history of these things. But I guess one aspect is that in those things, there was more of a fight for it. although I guess with women's suffrage, at least in the UK, it was somewhat divided into groups where one group was more strident than the other. And maybe that's a good strategy to have that kind of split. But I think that ultimately we've done somewhat well by not being too much of a kind of fighting activist group that gets people's backs up. And I don't know, I would be very cautious if we were going to try to go in that direction. So I'd hopefully be trying to learn other things from it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's important too.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly was in those other cases.
Mm-hmm. Seems like a good one for people who sort of look into sociology or history to sort of look into a bit more. And last question, I guess this is around the kind of careers thing. Do you feel like you have any concrete actions you feel comfortable recommending to people who want to contribute to achieving existential security?
I guess, in chapter 7 of The Precipice, I talk about this a bit. I think that in terms of thinking about your career, as I said, checking out what 80,000 hours recommends for a person like you would be a smart move. But I think that donations are a very sensible thing. I list on the precipice.com website, I have, there's a group of 7 different organizations that I split all the proceeds between. I think that they're actually a good set of kind of fairly blue chip locations for people who, the EA funds approach is more speculative, but maybe some people are interested in just, good down to earth places working on particular risks. So donations, but I also think that having a wider conversation about these things, it should be the kind of thing that you can talk about with your parents and talk about down the pub or with your colleagues, not necessarily in an EA kind of sense, but just talking about, I think that as a culture, we tend to relegate the idea of the end of humanity as a comic book plot. And it's not a plot for kind of literature in our canon. It's not something we take seriously. And I think that's a real shame. And that starting up these conversations in ways that help people realize that it is a grave and also a profound issue, not a kind of silly or juvenile issue, is a good step.
Great. And lastly, any thoughts on things that you'd like to do or achieve in the next 10 years?
I guess, I've been kind of hiding away in hermit mode, writing this book. So I'm really excited to be able to actually talk to a lot of people in government. That's one of my plans, and really try to talk to people at the UN and so forth as well. There's various connections happening in some of these places, and I just really want to, I guess, like a lot of people, get out there and meet people, not on Zoom or Skype, but actually, face to face, and start working on trying to work out what policies we can actually take in order to move forward.
Oh, I know I said that was the last question, but I must ask the second top question on the forum, which was actually, what does your personal investment portfolio look like? And are there any unusual steps that you've taken due to your study of the future?
Well, my one, I think, is pretty boring on this one, but ultimately, I don't have all that much spare money. I'm donating everything above, it's inflation adjusted. It's probably about £23,000 per year at the moment. And then what money I do have to save, well, since I have my own house with a mortgage, as you see here, then paying off the mortgage is generally the most sensible thing that one can do if you happen to have a giant loan like that. So sadly, not much money to go into kind of interesting portfolio of cleverly picked things.
Okay, with that sage financial advice, I'm afraid that's all that we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Toby. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm glad that we managed to get you back for most of it. And I'm sure the audience will have appreciated it very much.
Oh, thanks. It's been really great to be here with you.